Back live tonight, Turn in Focus, and thanks for staying on. Let's speak to the Democratic Alliance now. They say none of the state capture inquiry 11 recommendations for Parliament have been implemented. It comes after Chief Justice Raymond Zondo found that Parliament failed in its oversight role to hold the executive to account. DA Chief Whip Siviwe Gwarube joins me now to have this conversation a little bit further. Siviwe, good to have you, and thank you very much for your time. It's 16 recommendations from what I am seeing, but you are particularly highlighting the 11. Why?
Good evening, Thabo, and good evening to your viewers. Yes, I think part of the reason why we are talking about the 11 recommendations is because, of course, these are some of the recommendations we believe could have gone a long way to really reform the way in which Parliament does oversight. Because you'll recall, Thabo, during the entire process of the Zondo Commission, one would argue that Parliament was in fact one of the parties that was in the dark, in that it was found wanting in its constitutional obligations to hold the executive to account. And that I would make the argument that, in fact, our inaction as an institution aided and abetted state capture. And so there were a number of things which I think could have gone a long way to amend the way in which the rules are applied and how we do oversight over the executive. So a number of these include, for instance, the recommendation that was made around changing chairs of portfolio committees to being that of opposition members. That was immediately rejected by the subcommittee of the rules. The subcommittee of the Rules Committee usually deliberates and does the wording of the changing of the rules of the rules of Parliament, which then gets passed by the Rules Committee. Immediately, the ANC in that committee said, look, this was a non-starter, and that as the party that had, the majority in Parliament, they reserved the right to have their own committee chair. And our view is that, look, we are starting from a base where we've got to accept that Parliament has done a wrong, which we need to rectify. And the fact that there has been almost an unwillingness to change the way in which we've done business in the past, and there's been almost a hostility, Thabo, where the Zondo Commission report, even in Parliament, is now being treated as something of an overreach by the judiciary. And in fact, is even there are even talks about how these are merely recommendations and that they are not binding to Parliament. And be that as it may, one would think that Parliament would have a moment to pause for reflection on how we could do better. Another one of the recommendations, which has not only just resurfaced now during the Zondo Commission, it was something that has been touted for a very long time, which is the establishment of a portfolio committee over the presidency. And this could not be more important right now, Thabo, considering the fact that there are about 3 ministers now which sit within the presidency, including that of electricity. And the fact that the presidency still does not have a portfolio committee is a concern for us. Instead, the ANC was of the view that we should go on a study tour to go and see how this can be implemented. There's a problem because we are of the view that we should make the decision to establish this portfolio committee. And there are a number of other things, including making explicit which that is implicit, which is saying, those who are to be considered for Chapter 9 institutions or heads of institutions need to be explicitly excluded if they are politically aligned, are some of the things that we have been pushing for. And none of these things, and so, a lot of people are saying perhaps Parliament needs time.
Yeah.
But you recall that this final report was tabled exactly a year ago in June. So these things are being slowly, one by one, rejected at the Rules Committee, and we are saying they are coming here to die.
So we spent close to R1 billion, others say, for this process, where we say we wanted to find out what happened, where did we go wrong, and how do we fix it? And part of the things that this process that cost us R1 billion recommended was let's look at our toolkit as Parliament of oversight, whether it is effective. Are you saying to us that since then, even up until now, there is not a single reform or even a single change that has been brought into the toolkit of oversight in Parliament? I mean, you just mentioned one, the committee system and how that is made up. Is there anything else that has been brought into the toolkit of Parliament of oversight that you think is at least doing what it's supposed to do? I mean, we saw the police, the Hawks, and the SIU and the ESCOM board the other day at Scopa, which is chaired by a member of the IFP. Was that, in your gauging, a much more better process of oversight and accountability?
So to answer your first question, not a single one of those recommendations are being implemented. And from my reading, not a single one of them will be implemented at all, Thabo. There is absolutely no appetite from the ANC in Parliament to implement any reforms. There isn't any recognition that Parliament has been doing anything wrong, or at least has not been fulfilling its constitutional obligations. When we make the argument that, in fact, the reason why the Commission made recommendations is not an act of overreach, but to say, look, here are the gaps in the way in which you do business. The Constitution expects you to hold the executive to account in this way. This is why it is important that you do this job so that you can firewall institutions against corruption. But if we are not prepared to make any reforms, that means that what has been happening under state capture is only going to continue to happen. SCOPA has long been held as a convention, nothing that has been in the rules, but as a convention, SCOPA is held by a member of the opposition in terms of being a chair. But the recommendations from the report went as far as saying, make concessions to say, well, you may be a governing party, the oversight role in committees ought to be held by opposition members so that you can not have a situation where a chair of the committee is softballing a member of the executive only because they are of the same political party. But there are other recommendations which have been made. And the one I made an example of is the Portfolio Committee on the Presidency, which is incredibly important. And there are also other recommendations which have been made around making legislation so that we can solidify some of the things that are either convention or either implied. Because, of course, what is important is that we mustn't legislate for what we are seeing in front of us. And that's the argument as the DA we've been making, that we are not legislating to punish the ANC. We are not saying let's change the rules because of the ANC. We are saying let's change the rules so that it doesn't matter who is in government in the future, but we know that Parliament as an institution is stronger so that it can be able to hold the executive to account in a way that is meaningful. But the ANC has taken a stance where it is now hostile towards the report. It is questioning the standing of the report. It is saying that the report has overreached and that, in fact, those recommendations are simply recommendations and they have absolutely no bearing in how Parliament does its business. And our view is that that's a slap in the face to taxpayers and ordinary South Africans who watch this process over a period of 3 years after R1 billion, which was spent, where we expected to see that now that an investigation has happened, that these recommendations, at the very least, can guide Parliament in how we can really strengthen our oversight mechanism. And there is absolutely no appetite. And unfortunately, because the Rules Committee, like any other committee in Parliament, is governed by numbers, where these things come down to a vote, because the ANC has the numbers, they are able to vote down any recommendations or any recommendations that are put forward by any other political party. As a DA, we even went as far as saying we looked back into the history books of Parliament. We found that back in 2002, a process of interpellations were part of the rules of Parliament, where a member of Parliament could be able to interrogate a matter a lot more deeper than we are able to do in oral questions currently. And we made a proposal. We put together a formal proposal to the Zondo Committee. We showed exactly why this would be important, and this was effectively shut down, voted against. And so, and I don't think it's unfair to say that at the moment the ANC is simply saying to this report, well, we're going to tick the boxes and simply say we considered the recommendations, but we are simply not interested. And so a year later, after this report has been tabled to Parliament, there's no appetite to change anything. And so really what we've seen under state capture and what continues to happen in state institutions will continue to happen as long as the ANC has a majority in Parliament and they're able to use that majority to shut down accountability.
So without that political will and I suppose, as you put it, the political culture of if we are the majority, this is how we behave as the ANC caucus, how else do you get, because I mean in their speak they say no, we accept the recommendations of the Zondo Commission. In fact, we are the owners of this thing. We called for it, and therefore we're going to implement them. But if they are not, what other options do you have as members of Parliament?
Firstly, I think we need to make it clear to to members of the public that the ANC is in no way accepting the recommendations, and they are in no way intending on implementing those recommendations. They may own the process of the Zondo Commission as a process and the money that was spent, but they are hostile. They are openly hostile to the report that was produced, and there is a process of tearing it apart in saying that, well, this report is actually judicial overreach. And so our view is now we've got to go back to the drawing board to see, one, where can we, without actually, because of course we've also got to be careful about involving the court in the way in which Parliament ought to do its business, because we've got to respect the separation of powers. But there has to be a point, Thabo, where rationality has to triumph. And so we've got to see where Parliament is presented with overt facts, and they are simply choosing not to implement those, and see where we may have legal grounds. But at the end of the day, our best shot here of reforming Parliament really is to bring the ANC below 50% in the next elections. Because until then, we are stuck with the ruling party that is not interested in a Parliament that will work, because a working Parliament is not in the interest of an organization like the ANC, because they know that a working Parliament would essentially deal with people even within their own ranks. People like Cedric Follick, who are the chair of chairs, who was referred to the Ethics Committee last year for his alleged involvement in the Bosasa matter. There are sitting members of Parliament, sitting members of the executive who were fingered in that entire process. And so there is an interest within the ANC to not deal with those people politically. And so we are in a situation where we have to understand, and we let the public know, that it is not all members of Parliament who are not interested in making Parliament work, but of course they're hamstrung by the numbers. And so, one, we either have to explore our legal options, and number two, we've got to make sure that as political parties and as opposition parties who are interested in constitutionalism, that we work hard to win over votes so that we may make sure that the ANC dips below 50%, so that this kind of thing does not happen in perpetuity.
Siviwe Gwarube, I appreciate your time. Thanks for coming on, DA Chief Whip there for us tonight here on In Focus.